Okay, so if you've spent any time in the Bible, you have heard the phrase, the 12 tribes of Israel, probably dozens of times. It comes up everywhere, from the tribal territories in Joshua to the divided kingdom, or even having to seemingly do with the 144,000 in Revelation. Or perhaps it was the 12 apostles corresponding to the 12 tribes, or maybe the 12 gates in the New Jerusalem, each named after a tribe. The number 12 never goes away in the biblical story. Over and over again, it continues to matter. But I would argue that most of us, including myself, if you actually asked us to name all the 12 tribes, would get maybe 6 or 7 before it started getting a little fuzzy. And even fewer of us could tell you why the tribes are the way that they are, what each one was known for, what conflicts shaped them, which ones basically disappeared, and then which ones ultimately dominated the whole story. So that's what this video is. We're going to be going through all of it, where each of the tribes came from, their family drama behind their origins, what Jacob, who was the father of pretty much all of them, prophesied over each one, good or bad, their individual stories throughout the biblical narrative, in what eventually happened to all of them. And I'll tell you this up front, this is one of those topics where the more you dig in, the more you kind of realize how much, like, the whole Bible is actually just a downstream picture of this one family and what happened to it. It's like genuinely wild to consider. So, hello everyone. Today we are going to be talking about like a dozen things, and are going to be doing a full rundown of every tribe of Israel. Like I said, their origins, their stories, their fates. And if you enjoy biblical deep dives like this, please consider hitting the subscribe button, as it genuinely helps out my channel grow a lot. And yeah, all that being said, and without any further ado, let's get into it. So everything in the story actually starts with Jacob. Jacob is Isaac's son, Abraham's grandson, the third patriarch. He has a twin brother named Esau, and their rivalry runs all the way from the womb. Jacob eventually ends up working for his uncle Laban in Mesopotamia, and this is essentially where the 12 tribes actually begin, in one of the most chaotic family arrangements in the entire Old Testament. As the story goes, Jacob wants to marry Rachel, who was beautiful, Laban's younger daughter. Laban ultimately tricks him into marrying Leah, the first one, who is the older and seemingly unattractive one, and then allows Jacob to marry Rachel as well, a week later, in exchange for another 7 years of work. So now Jacob now has 2 wives who are sisters, and they are in a absolute fierce competition with one another. And then both of them give Jacob their personal servants as concubines. Bilhah, who was Rachel's, and then Zilpah, who was Leah's. And that's really interesting because in the world of the ancient Near East, children born through your servant could also be claimed as your own. So you end up with 4 women and 1 man in a procreation competition that turns into a breeding ground. And here's how the sons arrived, because the names of all the sons actually tell a rather interesting story. And as a side note, names are very important in Hebrew, so that's why this kind of all matters. So Leah actually goes first, since Rachel is initially barren. That's kind of a part of the whole story. And she has 4 sons in a rather quick succession. The first one is Reuben, which literally means see or behold a son, essentially meaning that Leah's hope is that Jacob will finally love her now that she's given him a son, because there's a whole sort of debacle there. And then she has Simeon, which means heard, because God heard that Leah was unloved. And then she had Levi, which means attached, because now surely Jacob will be attached to her now. And then she has Judah, which means praise, and she stops hoping for Jacob's love specifically and just praises God. So there's kind of like an arc there. But then Rachel shows up, still childless, and then gives Jacob her servant Bilhah. And then she has Dan, which means he has judged me. Rachel pretty much says that God has vindicated her then. Then she has Naphtali, which means wrestlings, which Rachel is pretty much saying that she has wrestled with her sister and won. And then it goes back to Leah, who had already stopped having children. So then she gives Jacob her own servant, Zilpah. So then she has Gad, which means good fortune, and then Asher, meaning happy, because Leah says that women will call her happy. And then, which this detail is just hilarious, Rachel trades some mandrakes, which was like an ancient plant that was thought to aid fertility, to Leah in exchange for a night with Jacob. Then Leah gets pregnant again, having Issachar, which means wages, because Leah effectively paid for Jacob's attention there. Then she had Zebulon, then a daughter named Dinah, who will become rather important later. And then finally, Rachel ends up conceiving Joseph. His name is May He Add Another, because Rachel is hoping for a second son, and she gets that second son eventually, but it actually costs her life as she dies in childbirth on the road. And then she names him Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow. Jacob replaces him, and then Benjamin, son of my right hand. So the 12 sons across Jacob were across 4 different mothers, with names that are all essentially chapters in that whole rivalrous story. But before we go any further into the actual story, there's something slightly confusing about the 12 tribes that's worth clearing up. Because the number 12 is both somehow constant and flexible throughout the Bible. What do I mean by that? Well, the issue is actually with Levi. So the Levites become the priestly tribe. They're the ones who serve in the tabernacle and the temple, who are distributed throughout the land pretty much as ministers and teachers. They take on like the priestly function. And because of this special role, they don't actually receive a territorial allotment the way that the other tribes do. So they don't get land. They get cities within other tribes' territories, but they don't unfortunately get any land of their own. And that kind of takes you down to 11 tribes with a different territory. So to keep the number at 12, Joseph essentially gets split into 2 sons. You have Ephraim and Manasseh. And then this happens through the famous crossed hands blessings in Genesis 48, where Jacob, intentionally against Joseph's protest, puts his right hand on the younger Ephraim and his left hand on the older Manasseh. So you have another story of the younger being put over the older one. This is Genesis practically just doing this thing over and over and over again. But so the practical 12 tribes with territory are Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. Levi is always listed as a tribe in genealogical context, just not in the whole land division, which is kind of how they did it back then. But that ultimately brings us now to Genesis 49, which is one of the most fascinating and underread chapters in the Bible. So Jacob, who just had all these kids, is now on his deathbed, and he's calling his 12 sons to him and delivering a prophetic word over each one. Sometimes this prophetic word was a blessing. Sometimes it's what is more felt like a curse, always, having something interesting to say about each one. Reuben goes as the firstborn, and unfortunately he immediately gets demoted. He says, "You shall not excel because you went up to your father's bed." This refers to an incident that happened in Genesis 35 that gets reported in like a single verse without comment pretty much. It says that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah and his father's concubine. It's just a random line in there, and then the story just moves on from that, but Jacob evidently never forgot it. So the firstborn's double portion blessing and the right of leadership don't go to Reuben like it should have. Simeon and Levi now are addressed together, and it's not pleasant to the ears. It says, "Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, in their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." So this refers to the Shechem massacre in Genesis 34, which we'll be coming back to. And then the curse is that they'll be scattered rather than having a unified territory, which for Simeon, this means essentially being absorbed into Judah's land. And for Levi, interestingly, the scattering ends up being transformed into their calling, which is rather interesting. Then there's Judah, who gets the centerpiece of the blessing. Judah is a lion's cub. "From the prey, my son, you have gone up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of peoples." So here you have the Lion of Judah, in the permanent scepter, the one in whom the nations come. This is the foundational text for the Davidic kingship in all of the messianic expectations that ultimately flow from it. As we know, Jesus is from the line of the tribe of Judah, and it's planted all the way here in Genesis 49 in a deathbed speech. Then you have Zebulun, which will dwell at the shore of the sea, positioned toward the coast and the trade routes. Then there's Issachar, who gets a rather complicated image, quote, "A strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant at forced labor." So they're good farmers in fertile land, possibly too comfortable, willing to work hard, but they're not necessarily warriors. Dan, on the other hand, shall judge his peoples as one of the tribes of Israel. So the name Dan actually means judge. And then it goes on to say that Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backward. So they do a lot of ambushing and guerrilla tactics and warfare. We'll ultimately see this play out in Samson. Then you have Gad, who raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. So his territory essentially is going to be exposed and contested, but he'll be able to give as good as he gets. Then there's Asher, whose food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. So they're prosperous, they're fertile land, and they got good food, evidently. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. So seemingly they'll be like free and swift and fertile. Joseph gets the longest blessing. He was Jacob's favorite son and Rachel's firstborn. Joseph is a fruitful bough by spring. His branches run over the wall. So he gets blessings from heaven above and the deep below. The tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh will inherit this, and between them occupy some of the most significant land, the most significant territory in the land. And then you have Benjamin. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, at the evening dividing the spoil. So they're a small tribe, they're fierce fighters, and we'll come back to this. So that's just a little bit about each tribe, but now we have to go through each tribe and look at what actually happens to them in the biblical narrative, because it is crazy.